Hey guys, welcome to a journey into the forgotten lives of Victorian England's women of the night. Behind the glittering halls of empire and the polished image of morality, thousands of women lived stories rarely told, of survival, struggle and resilience in the face of silence. Tonight we'll step quietly into their world, uncovering voices long hidden from history. As you settle in for a moment of peace and reflection, I invite you to share in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is. I always love seeing how far our community of night owls reaches. If you enjoy drifting into the timeless, untold stories of history to unwind, consider subscribing for more soothing journeys like this one. Victorian England has often been remembered as the age of strict morality, a society cloaked in propriety, etiquette, and the language of restraint. It was the era of Queen Victoria, whose long reign from 1837 to 1901 came to symbolise stability, industrial progress, and the ideal of the domestic family. The image presented to the world was one of moral uprightness, where the family home was sacred, where women were guardians of virtue, and where men were expected to embody both discipline and responsibility. Yet behind the polished veneer of Victorian morality lay an entire world of contradiction. London, the capital of empire and progress, was also the city with one of the largest populations of prostitutes in Europe. By the mid-19th century, estimates suggested that there were tens of thousands of women engaged in sex work in the metropolis, though numbers varied widely depending on the source. These women were both visible and invisible, visible on the streets, in brothels, in popular scandal sheets, invisible in the official narratives of Victorian virtue. The paradox of the Victorian age was that while society outwardly condemned prostitution as a vice and a moral failing, it was simultaneously tolerated, regulated, and deeply embedded in the social fabric. It was an open secret, an institution that coexisted with the ideal of the respectable family. The very men who preached morality in Parliament or from pulpits were often among those who sustained the trade. This duality reflected what historians have called the two nations of Victorian life: the respectable classes on one side and the submerged world of poverty, crime and vice on the other. The two were not separate, but deeply intertwined. The roots of this contradiction can be traced to the economic and social upheavals of the age. The 19th century was a time of vast transformation. Industrialization drew people to cities in unprecedented numbers, disrupting traditional family structures and creating vast urban poverty. For many women, especially those from working-class backgrounds, employment opportunities were scarce and wages were meagre. Domestic service, factory work or casual labour were among the few options available, yet even these rarely provided enough for survival. In this environment, prostitution emerged not simply as a moral choice, but often as a necessity, a grim alternative to starvation or the workhouse. Yet the Victorian public often preferred to see prostitution through the lens of sin rather than survival. Newspapers and social reformers described it as a plague upon society, a threat to public morality, and a danger to men's health. Middle-class anxieties about the fallen woman were expressed in countless pamphlets, sermons, and novels. These anxieties reflected not only concern for morality, but also fear of social disorder. Prostitutes were thought to embody urban chaos, disease, crime, and temptation, threatening the fragile order of the respectable city. But the reality of prostitution was more complex than the moral panic suggested. It was not a homogeneous group of fallen women, but a spectrum of experiences and conditions. At one end were the streetwalkers who worked in dangerous conditions for pennies, exposed to violence from both clients and police. At the other end were the so-called courtesans, who entertained wealthy clients in lavish apartments, sometimes securing financial stability and even cultural influence. Between these extremes were countless women who drifted in and out of prostitution depending on circumstance, working as seamstresses or laundresses when possible, turning to sex work when survival demanded it. The hypocrisy of Victorian society was perhaps most evident in the law. Officially, prostitution itself was not illegal in England, but nearly every activity associated with it was subject to regulation or criminalisation. Brothels could be raided, women could be arrested for soliciting, and disorderly houses were frequently shut down. Yet the trade continued unabated, partly because it met a demand that no amount of moralizing could erase. Men of all classes, workers, soldiers, clerks and gentlemen, sought out prostitutes. Some reformers claimed that prostitution was a necessary evil, an outlet that protected respectable women from male lust. This belief, however cynical, was part of the rationale behind tolerating the practice while simultaneously condemning it. Religious and charitable organisations responded to prostitution with campaigns of rescue. Homes for fallen women were established, aiming to reform prostitutes through discipline, prayer and domestic training. These institutions reflected both genuine compassion and paternalistic control, offering an escape but also demanding repentance and conformity to middle-class ideals of femininity. Few women remained long in such homes. Many returned to the streets, unable to adapt to or accept the constraints of reform. The cycle of condemnation and rescue became a recurring feature of Victorian discourse on prostitution, highlighting the tension between moral judgment and social reality. Perhaps the most striking feature of Victorian attitudes toward prostitution was the way the burden of blame fell almost entirely on women. The prostitute herself was stigmatized as the embodiment of sin, while her male clients were rarely named or shamed. Even in cases where men transmitted disease or ruined reputations, the social censure fell upon the woman. This double standard was rooted in Victorian gender ideology, which held women responsible for maintaining sexual purity while granting men a degree of indulgence in their passions. The prostitute thus became the scapegoat of a society unwilling to confront the contradictions of its own moral code. Despite the stigma, prostitution was woven into the fabric of urban life. It was present in the alleyways of London, in the entertainment districts, in music halls and taverns. Guides to the city sometimes included thinly veiled references to brothels, and sensational literature thrived on tales of seduction and vice. The existence of prostitution was not hidden. It was too widespread for that, but it was framed in a way that preserved the illusion of a moral society. Respectable families could ignore the women standing on corners, dismissing them as an unfortunate but distant reality. Yet the presence of prostitution in every major city spoke to the limits of Victorian morality. In many ways, the story of prostitution in Victorian England is a story of invisibility. These women were at once everywhere and nowhere, present in statistics, scandals and reform tracts, yet absent from the narratives of national greatness and imperial progress. They left few written records of their own, their voices drowned out by those who judged or sought to reform them. To reconstruct their lives requires piecing together fragments from court records, medical reports, and the accounts of reformers, sources that are themselves shaped by prejudice. Yet within these fragments a different picture emerges, one of resilience, survival, and humanity in the face of social scorn. As the 19th century unfolded, debates over prostitution grew increasingly urgent, especially with the rise of medical concerns about venereal disease. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s represented one of the most controversial attempts to regulate prostitution, bringing questions of health, law, and women's rights into the forefront of national debate. But before reaching that point, one must understand the deeper context, the poverty, hypocrisy, and structural inequality that made prostitution such a persistent feature of Victorian society. The age that prided itself on morality could not escape the contradictions that lay at its heart. The Victorian era, then, was both a time of extraordinary progress and profound blindness. It celebrated ideals of purity while tolerating practices that undermined them. It condemned prostitutes while depending upon their existence. It sought to reform them while ignoring the conditions that drove them to the streets. This contradiction is essential to understanding not only the lives of prostitutes, but the society that shaped and judged them. Their forgotten histories reveal the shadows behind the bright facade of Victorian progress, reminding us that morality, when wielded as a mask, often conceals more than it reveals. To understand why prostitution became such a prominent feature of Victorian England, one must begin with the harsh economic and social realities that shaped women's lives in the 19th century. Industrialisation, hailed as the engine of British progress, also produced immense dislocation, inequality, and insecurity. The glittering wealth of the middle and upper classes was built upon the toil of workers who crowded into cities in search of wages. For women, especially, the promises of industrial opportunity often turned into the grim realities of exploitation, poverty, and desperation. Against this backdrop, prostitution emerged less as a moral failure than as one of the few available strategies for survival. The economic foundations of Victorian England were profoundly gendered. Respectable middle-class ideology confined women to the domestic sphere, celebrating the image of the angel in the house, the pure devoted wife and mother whose role was to sustain the home. But this ideal applied only to those who could afford it. For the vast majority of working-class women, life required labour outside the home. Employment options, however, were severely limited. Domestic service was the most common occupation for young women, yet it was gruelling, poorly paid, and often temporary. A servant could be dismissed without notice, leaving her suddenly unemployed in a city where networks of support were fragile. Factory work in textiles or other industries offered another avenue, but wages were meagre and conditions harsh, with long hours and constant risk of injury. Seamstresses, laundresses, and charwomen eked out livelihoods at the very margins, often earning barely enough to pay for rent and food. The precariousness of these occupations meant that any disruption, illness, unemployment, or the death of a family breadwinner could push women into crisis. The workhouse, the grim institution established under the Poor Law, was dreaded as a place of last resort. Designed to deter reliance on public assistance, workhouses were notorious for their harsh discipline and degrading conditions. Many women preferred almost anything to the shame and suffering of the workhouse. For some, prostitution became an alternative, however temporary or reluctant, to starvation or institutionalization. The transition into prostitution was rarely dramatic. Rather, it was often the result of incremental pressures. A young woman might arrive in London to work as a servant, only to lose her position through no fault of her own. With no family nearby, no savings, and few prospects, she might take to the streets out of sheer necessity. In other cases, women combined casual prostitution with other forms of labour, supplementing inadequate wages with occasional encounters. Contemporary reports acknowledged this reality. Henry Mayhew, the journalist whose monumental work London Labour and the London Poor documented the lives of the city's marginalised classes, described countless women who turned to prostitution not out of vice, but out of economic compulsion. Migration into cities intensified these vulnerabilities. By mid-century, London's population had swelled to over 2 million, and other industrial centres like Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham also expanded rapidly. Rural poverty drove many young women into cities with hopes of employment, but the competition for work was fierce. Many ended up in lodging houses or cheap tenements, where overcrowding, squalor, and insecurity were the norm. In such environments, the boundaries between respectability and vice were porous. Prostitution thrived in districts where poverty was most acute, becoming part of the urban landscape. The situation was compounded by gendered expectations and double standards. Respectable employment was often conditional on a woman's reputation. A servant suspected of impropriety could be dismissed, while a factory worker rumoured to have loose morals might find herself shunned. Once a woman was marked as fallen, even unjustly, her chances of securing respectable work diminished sharply. Prostitution then became one of the few avenues still open, reinforcing a vicious cycle of stigma and survival. The role of alcohol and the environment of the urban poor cannot be overlooked. Taverns, gin shops and music halls were central to working-class leisure, and they were also spaces where prostitution flourished. Women who struggled to pay for lodging or meals could sometimes find immediate relief by selling sex to patrons. The intertwining of poverty, entertainment and prostitution blurred the line between necessity and opportunity. While some women may have sought escape from hardship through temporary pleasures, for many the choice was made under duress, with few viable alternatives. Children too were drawn into this cycle. Orphaned or abandoned girls, left to fend for themselves on the streets, were particularly vulnerable to exploitation. Reports from charitable organisations describe shocking cases of girls as young as 12 or 13 entering prostitution. The lack of formal education and protective structures meant that these children had little chance of escape once they were drawn into the trade. They became part of what reformers decried as the child prostitution scandal of the late 19th century, though the issue had existed long before it gained public attention. The wages of working-class men also played a role. In many families, the income of male breadwinners was unstable, subject to fluctuations in employment and health. When men could not provide, women were forced to find ways to support households. In some cases, prostitution became a means of supplementing family income, though this reality was often hidden beneath layers of shame and secrecy. Victorian discourse tended to present prostitutes as isolated individuals, but in truth many of them remained connected to families, sending money to parents, siblings, or children. Their choices, however stigmatized, were often acts of economic contribution. Middle-class observers, looking down upon the working poor, often misinterpreted these dynamics. To them, prostitution appeared as evidence of moral weakness, idleness, or lack of self-control. They ignored or dismissed the structural forces of poverty, wage inequality, and gender discrimination that left women with so few options. Charitable literature frequently spoke of saving women from their sin, while failing to address the economic conditions that made prostitution so prevalent. This disconnect between moral judgment and material reality epitomized the hypocrisy of Victorian attitudes. The language of fallen women further reinforced stigma. To fall suggested a single irreversible lapse, a moment of weakness from which no redemption was possible without external intervention. In practice, however, women's paths into prostitution were complex, gradual, and varied. Some entered the trade after seduction and abandonment, others through economic desperation, and still others drifted between respectability and vice, depending on circumstances. Yet once labelled as fallen, women faced barriers that made exit increasingly difficult. It is important to recognise that prostitution was not merely a symptom of urban poverty, but also a response to it. For some women, particularly those who managed to secure regular clients or established themselves in brothels, prostitution offered a degree of financial independence unattainable in other forms of labour. While the dangers were considerable, violence, disease, and social stigma, the immediate cash income could exceed that of a servant or factory worker. This paradox explains why, despite the risks, prostitution persisted so widely in Victorian cities. The road to the streets, then, was paved not by moral corruption but by structural inequality. Industrial progress, hailed as the triumph of Victorian civilization, created winners and losers, and women of the working classes often bore the brunt of its costs. They were trapped between ideals of domestic virtue they could not attain and economic pressures they could not escape. Prostitution became the shadow side of industrial capitalism, an institution sustained not only by male demand, but also by the failures of the labour market, the inadequacies of social welfare, and the hypocrisies of moral discourse. By mid-century, the presence of prostitutes in every major city was undeniable. They were part of the nightly rhythm of urban life, gathering in districts notorious for vice, visible to anyone who cared to see. For the women themselves, the road to the streets was rarely a matter of choice in the sense Victorians imagined. It was, more often, the last step in a series of constrained decisions shaped by poverty, limited opportunity, and the rigid structures of gender and class. Their stories illuminate the underside of progress, reminding us that the greatness of the Victorian age was built not only on industry and empire, but also on the forgotten sacrifices of its most vulnerable inhabitants. If Victorian society was haunted by the image of the fallen woman, nowhere was this figure more visible than in the streets of London. The metropolis, with its grand avenues, gaslit thoroughfares and shadowed alleys, became both a stage and a trap for tens of thousands of women who relied on prostitution for survival. Their presence was not confined to obscure corners of the city, it was interwoven with the very fabric of urban life. From the bustling West End to the dim back streets of the East End, prostitution took on many forms, shaping the geography, rhythms and social dynamics of the 19th century capital. The London of the mid-19th century was a city of stark contrasts. Theatres, music halls and fashionable shops flourished alongside slums, lodging houses and gin shops. For prostitutes, this environment offered both opportunity and danger. The streets provided a visible marketplace where women could solicit clients, but they also exposed them to harassment, violence and disease. To walk the streets at night as a prostitute was to navigate an uncertain terrain where survival depended on quick judgment, physical resilience, and an ability to read both spaces and men. Street walking was the most common and most precarious form of prostitution. Women often worked in specific districts known for vice. Covent Garden, once celebrated as a centre of theatre and culture, was infamous by the Victorian era for its prostitutes, who mingled with market workers, actors, and visitors seeking diversion. The Haymarket, similarly, became synonymous with nightwalkers who thronged the pavement under the glow of gas lamps. The East End, with its labyrinth of narrow alleys, offered another hub of prostitution, often associated with poverty and crime. The geography of prostitution mirrored the city's inequalities, stretching from fashionable districts frequented by wealthier clients to the desperate back streets where women accepted pennies for survival. Life on the streets demanded constant vigilance. Prostitutes faced dangers not only from clients but also from the authorities. Police patrolled areas of known vice, arresting women for soliciting or labelling them as disorderly. Though prostitution itself was not illegal, the broad powers of police discretion meant that women could be targeted, fined, or imprisoned on charges that were often vague. Court records reveal countless cases of women accused of being common prostitutes or causing annoyance, charges that required little evidence beyond the testimony of an officer. The law thus became both an instrument of control and a source of vulnerability, reinforcing the marginality of women whose survival depended on public visibility. Violence was a constant threat. Prostitutes were frequently attacked, robbed, or even murdered by clients who knew that their victims were unlikely to receive justice. Reports of violence against prostitutes filled newspapers, often sensationalized to attract readers. The most infamous case would come in the 1880s with the Jack the Ripper murders in Whitechapel, where the brutal killings of working-class prostitutes exposed both the vulnerability of these women and society's indifference to their suffering. Yet, long before the Ripper, prostitutes lived with the knowledge that danger was part of their nightly routine. Many carried knives or relied on collective presence, working in pairs or groups to reduce risks. The daily lives of prostitutes were shaped not only by the dangers of the streets, but also by the practicalities of survival. Lodging houses provided temporary shelter, charging by the night or even by the hour. For some women, income from prostitution was just enough to secure a bed and a meal. Others were forced to sleep rough, their earnings insufficient for even the cheapest accommodations. The constant cycle of earning and spending left little room for stability. Poverty, debt, and uncertainty defined the existence of many streetwalkers who lived perpetually on the edge of destitution. Clothing played a significant role in the life of a prostitute. Respectability in Victorian society was closely linked to appearance, and prostitutes often adopted styles intended to attract attention while walking a fine line between allure and disrepute. Bright dresses, feathers, and shawls marked women on the streets, making them both conspicuous to potential clients and vulnerable to police. Some women pawned clothing when desperate, then reclaimed it after a successful night, a cycle that reflected the precariousness of their lives. Others invested in dresses that signalled a higher level of clientele, hoping to escape the uncertainty of street walking by attracting wealthier patrons. Health was another pressing concern. Long hours spent outdoors in cold or wet conditions weakened women's bodies, leaving them susceptible to illness. Venereal disease was an ever-present threat, with little effective treatment available before the widespread use of medical science in the 20th century. Women suffering from syphilis or gonorrhea often found themselves doubly stigmatized, condemned not only for their occupation but also for the illness that society blamed on their supposed immorality. For many, the cycle of disease and poverty was inescapable, contributing to the high mortality rates among prostitutes. Yet daily life was not solely defined by hardship. Prostitutes also forged communities, friendships, and informal networks of support. Lodging houses and street corners became spaces where women shared information, warned one another about violent clients, and offered companionship in an otherwise hostile city. Despite the stigma attached to their work, prostitutes were not entirely isolated. Some maintained ties with families, sending money to relatives or caring for children. Others navigated dual identities, working as seamstresses or washerwomen by day while turning to prostitution at night. These complexities defy the simplistic image of the fallen woman and reveal the resilience with which women adapted to their circumstances. Brothels offered an alternative to the dangers of the street, though they came with their own challenges. These establishments ranged from low-end disorderly houses to more organised institutions managed by madams. Life in a brothel provided a measure of protection from the police and the elements, but it also subjected women to the control of owners who profited from their labour. Brothel prostitutes often had more regular clients and slightly better conditions, but they also surrendered a portion of their earnings. Some women moved between the streets and brothels depending on opportunities, highlighting the fluidity of prostitution in Victorian London. Popular culture both reflected and shaped perceptions of daily life for prostitutes. Sensational novels and penny papers described the dark underworld of London with lurid detail, drawing fascinated readers into stories of seduction, crime and vice. Music halls and theatres sometimes featured prostitutes in thinly veiled caricatures, presenting them as comic figures or tragic warnings. These representations contributed to the stigma women faced, reinforcing stereotypes that bore little resemblance to the complexities of real lives. Yet they also revealed society's fascination with the very practices it claimed to condemn. For the women themselves, survival was a daily negotiation. Each night required decisions: where to stand, whom to trust, how to avoid police attention, and how to stretch limited earnings. There was little security, no social safety net, and minimal recognition of their humanity. Yet within this harsh reality, women displayed ingenuity, courage, and solidarity. They developed strategies to endure, even as society sought to erase or condemn them. The streets of London thus became both the backdrop and the battleground of prostitution in Victorian England. They were spaces of visibility, where women could not be ignored, yet also spaces of marginality, where their lives were discounted. To walk the gaslit streets as a prostitute was to embody the contradictions of the age, the tension between public morality and private demand, between condemnation and tolerance, between survival and stigma. Their daily lives, while often harsh, testify to the resilience of those who navigated the dangers of the city in order to endure. Victorian England, with its imposing facades of morality and order, harboured deep unease about sexuality, disease, and the contradictions of gender. The age's obsession with respectability was matched only by its fear of contamination, physical, moral, and social. These anxieties crystallised in the 1860s around a set of laws that sought to regulate prostitution in the name of public health, the infamous Contagious Diseases Acts. They were among the most controversial measures of the 19th century, not because of their stated goal, to reduce venereal disease, but because of the way they targeted women, laid bare the double standard of Victorian morality, and expanded the power of the state into the most intimate aspects of life. The Acts did not emerge from a vacuum. For decades, reformers had warned that prostitution threatened both the nation's moral fibre and its military efficiency. By the mid-19th century, the British Army and Navy were plagued by high infection rates of syphilis and gonorrhea. Official reports estimated that 1 in 3 servicemen was incapacitated at some point by venereal disease, weakening regiments and costing the state millions in treatment and lost service. Military doctors urged Parliament to confront what they called a national disgrace. Their proposed solution was not to restrict male behaviour, but to control the women who serviced soldiers and sailors. The first Contagious Diseases Act passed in 1864 with little debate, almost hidden within other legislation. It applied to a handful of garrison towns and naval ports, giving police the power to arrest women suspected of prostitution and compel them to undergo medical examinations. Those found to be infected were confined in lock hospitals until cured, often for months at a time. In 1866 and 1869, Parliament strengthened and expanded the law. More towns were included, police powers grew broader, and the procedures became increasingly systematic. By the end of the decade, entire districts of women lived under the shadow of surveillance, detention, and forced examination. The practice was brutal. Women, many of them poor and powerless, were subject to compulsory speculum examinations, an invasive and humiliating procedure performed by male doctors, often without consent. Critics would later call it instrumental rape. A woman need not be caught in the act of prostitution. Mere suspicion was enough to justify her detention. Meanwhile, the men who purchased sex remained untouched by the law. This stark asymmetry laid bare the hypocrisy of Victorian society. Male vice was tolerated, even protected, while female survival was criminalised. Supporters of the Acts defended them as a matter of national health and security. Doctors cited declining infection rates in certain garrison towns, arguing that regulation worked. Army officers praised the measures for preserving the fighting capacity of their troops. Some philanthropists even framed the Acts as benevolent, claiming that medical confinement saved women from the dangers of the streets. But for critics, such justifications only deepened the outrage. The Acts institutionalized the sexual double standard, treating women as mere vessels for disease and stripping them of dignity under the guise of public welfare. It was in this climate that one of the most remarkable social movements of the century emerged. Josephine Butler, a clergyman's wife and passionate reformer, took up the cause of repeal with extraordinary courage. In 1869, she helped found the Ladies' National Association for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts. Unlike earlier campaigns for moral reform, this movement was led and organised by women. Butler travelled the country, delivering fiery speeches to often hostile audiences of men. She argued that the Acts legitimised state-sponsored violation of women's bodies, entrenched the double standard, and reduced poor women to instruments for male pleasure. Her speeches drew on both moral and emotional appeals. "We're told," she declared in one address, "that this law protects men from disease. I say it makes women the victims of a legalised outrage, sacrificed upon the altar of men's passions." Butler framed the struggle not only as one for the dignity of prostitutes, but for all women, since the Acts asserted the principle that female bodies could be subjected to state control. The repeal campaign quickly gained momentum. Women who had never before engaged in politics signed petitions, organised meetings, and wrote pamphlets. The movement spread into Parliament, where Liberal MPs sympathetic to Butler's cause challenged the Acts on the floor of the House of Commons. Newspapers published letters and testimonies from women who had suffered under the law, stories of humiliation, ruined livelihoods, and months of confinement. At the heart of the controversy was the question of the state's role in regulating private life. Did the duty to protect public health justify such invasive measures? Could disease control ever excuse what amounted to coerced medical assault? For many Victorians, the answer increasingly became no. Even some who accepted the moral stigma of prostitution recoiled at the thought of the government intruding so deeply into the personal realm. The debates raged for nearly 2 decades. Supporters clung to statistics suggesting that infections in certain towns had decreased. Opponents highlighted the injustice of a system that punished women while ignoring men. The conflict drew in not only feminists and parliamentarians, but also church leaders, physicians, and members of the public. By the early 1880s, the balance had shifted. The sheer visibility of the campaign, fueled by Butler's tireless activism, eroded the Act's legitimacy. In 1886, after years of protest, Parliament finally repealed the Contagious Diseases Acts. It was a landmark victory, not only for the women subjected to their cruelty, but for the nascent feminist movement that had mobilised against them. The campaign marked one of the first times women organised nationally to influence public policy, and it set a precedent for future struggles over suffrage, labour rights and social reform. Yet the repeal also revealed the limits of victory. Prostitution did not vanish, nor did venereal disease. Soldiers and sailors continued to contract infections, and women continued to face poverty and stigma. The repeal had ended the state's most egregious intrusion, but had not solved the underlying tensions. For prostitutes, life remained precarious, dangerous, and morally condemned. The legacy of the Acts was complex. They demonstrated how deeply Victorian society was invested in controlling women's bodies, how easily public health arguments could be marshalled to justify coercion, and how fragile the boundary was between morality and medicine. They also left a permanent mark on the feminist movement, proving that collective action could overturn laws and challenge entrenched power. For the women who endured the examinations, the Acts were not abstract debates but lived trauma. They left behind little in the way of personal testimony. Poor women rarely had the means to record their experiences, but their silence speaks volumes. Through the pamphlets, speeches and campaigns of Butler and her allies, we can glimpse the pain, humiliation and resistance that defined their encounters with Victorian law. As the Acts fell, they opened the door to new debates about how society should respond to prostitution and disease. Those questions would not disappear with repeal. Instead, they shifted into the realm of medicine and morality. as doctors and reformers began to grapple more openly with the realities of venereal infection in the female body and the consequences of sexual commerce. It is to these struggles of medicine, disease, and the intimate politics of the body that the story of Victorian prostitution now turns. In the shadow of Victorian morality, medicine became both a tool of salvation and an instrument of control. Few issues exposed this duality more starkly than the treatment of venereal disease, which haunted the 19th century as a silent epidemic. Syphilis and gonorrhea spread relentlessly through Britain's cities, infecting soldiers, sailors, workers, and their families. Behind the polished fronts of townhouses and the stern sermons of pulpits lay a quiet terror, disease that deformed infants, crippled adults, and eroded entire generations. To many Victorians, prostitution was not only a moral plague but a biological one, and the female body became the stage upon which this crisis unfolded. The medical profession of the 19th century approached venereal disease with a mixture of scientific curiosity, moral judgment, and grim resignation. Doctors of the period lacked effective treatments. The main remedy for syphilis was mercury, administered through ointments, pills, or vapour baths. Patients endured salivation, tooth loss, and organ damage, often worse than the disease itself. Gonorrhea was treated with painful injections of caustic substances. Neither approach offered reliable cures. Instead, medicine could only manage symptoms and observe the slow, destructive course of infection. Prostitutes became the unwilling subjects of these medical experiments. Lock hospitals, institutions dedicated to treating venereal disease, were filled with poor women confined under the Contagious Diseases Acts, or admitted voluntarily when no other refuge was available. Within their walls, the boundary between care and coercion blurred. Women were examined, prodded, and tested with new treatments that promised little hope. Records from London's Lock Hospital described wards of women lined in narrow beds, many only in their teens, their bodies ravaged by disease and poverty. To Victorian doctors, these women served as both patients and data. Medical journals reported detailed case studies, lesions described with cold precision, reproductive organs charted like maps of decay, moral judgments interwoven with clinical notes. Rarely did these accounts consider the humanity of the women, their circumstances, or the men who had infected them. Instead, the prostitute was constructed as the source of contagion, a necessary subject of medical surveillance. Male clients, who carried infection back to their wives and children, remained largely invisible in the records. The fascination with the female body extended beyond disease. Victorian medicine was steeped in ideas of sexual difference, often framed in terms of weakness, instability, and deviance. The womb in particular was viewed as a seat of pathology. Hysteria, a diagnosis applied overwhelmingly to women, was believed to arise from disorders of the reproductive system. Prostitutes, whose lives transgressed the ideals of chastity and motherhood, were often presented as living examples of what happened when female sexuality strayed from its natural path. To many doctors, their illnesses were not only physical but moral. Yet medicine also carried an undercurrent of compassion. Some physicians recognized the injustice of a system that blamed women while absolving men. Reports occasionally acknowledged that soldiers and sailors spread disease recklessly, and a few progressive doctors urged greater responsibility from male patients. Philanthropic groups worked alongside hospitals to offer prostitutes not just treatment, but training in sewing, laundry, or domestic service, hoping to provide alternatives to the streets. These efforts, however, were often bound up with religious instruction and moral discipline, reinforcing the view that women's bodies and lives needed to be reshaped into respectability. The suffering caused by venereal disease was profound. Syphilis, in its advanced stages, attacked the nervous system, producing paralysis, insanity, and death. Infants born to infected mothers suffered congenital syphilis, condemned to lives of deformity or early graves. The spectre of tainted blood terrified Victorian families, especially in the upper classes where concerns about heredity and lineage loomed large. Writers like Charles Dickens and George Bernard Shaw hinted at these hidden tragedies in their works, though often obliquely. The subject was too scandalous to confront directly. Prostitutes lived at the intersection of these fears. They were seen as both victims and vectors, pitied for their suffering, yet reviled as spreaders of disease. Their bodies were examined in hospital wards. debated in parliamentary chambers and dissected in medical journals. Rarely were their voices heard. Occasionally, testimonies survive. Women who described the humiliation of forced examinations, the agony of mercury treatments, the despair of confinement. One anonymous woman, recorded in a report to the House of Commons, lamented, "They said it was to cure me, but it felt like punishment. I was treated not as a woman, but as a thing." The intertwining of medicine and morality ensured that venereal disease remained more than a health crisis. It was a cultural drama. Debates about its control drew in physicians, clergymen, feminists and lawmakers, each framing the prostitute's body as a symbol of larger anxieties about class, gender, empire and modernity. The failure of medicine to cure venereal disease until the discovery of penicillin in the 20th century meant that Victorians lived with a constant undercurrent of fear. In this environment, the prostitute was never simply a worker or an individual. She was constructed as a site of danger, contamination and control. Yet amid the darkness, the medical encounter also created moments of uneasy recognition. Some doctors came to see in their patients not just disease but humanity. They noted the youth of many women, the poverty that drove them, the desperation that shaped their choices. These fleeting acknowledgements hinted at the contradictions of Victorian medicine, capable of compassion, yet often complicit in oppression. As the century wore on, discussions of venereal disease became entangled with broader questions of heredity, degeneration, and the health of the nation. The prostitute, once a marginal figure, was placed at the centre of debates about Britain's future. Was she a symptom of urban poverty, a corrupter of national vigour, or a victim of male exploitation? Medicine could not answer these questions, but it gave them form in the language of pathology. For the women themselves, the experience of disease was inescapably intimate. Pain, shame, and uncertainty shadowed their lives. Their bodies bore the marks not only of infection, but of the social structures that defined them as outcasts. In the hospital ward, under the doctor's gaze, they became symbols of a society struggling to reconcile morality, science, and desire. The story of prostitution in Victorian England, then, cannot be told without the story of medicine. Disease shaped not only the lives of women, but the very way society understood sexuality and gender. The medical encounter, with all its cruelty and compassion, defined the prostitute's body as a battlefield on which Victorian anxieties played out. As the debates over law gave way to debates over health, the prostitute remained at the centre of controversy, her body a canvas for fears of contagion, morality, and decline. In the next chapter, the narrative turns to another dimension of Victorian hypocrisy, the cultural double standard that condemned women while indulging men, a contradiction that shaped both policy and personal lives in the Age of Empire. Victorian England was a society obsessed with morality, yet it was also a society built upon contradiction. Few contradictions were more glaring than the double standard applied to men and women in matters of sexuality. The same culture that exalted female purity, celebrated the angel of the house, and demanded chastity from women also tolerated, and even quietly sanctioned, male indulgence in prostitution. This hypocrisy was not a secret but an open wound in the social fabric, one that reformers, feminists and even some clergymen struggled to confront. At the heart of the Victorian moral code stood the ideal of female virtue. Women, particularly of the middle and upper classes, were expected to embody purity, modesty and self-sacrifice. A good woman was a virgin before marriage and a faithful wife afterward, her role confined to the domestic sphere. The moral value of a woman was intimately tied to her sexual reputation. Once lost, it could never be regained. The label of fallen woman condemned countless females to social death, whether through seduction, rape, or a conscious turn to prostitution. Men, by contrast, were judged by a different measure. Male desire was considered natural, even inevitable, and prostitution was framed as a necessary outlet for it. Doctors and moralists alike argued that without such outlets, men might suffer physical or psychological harm. The prostitute, in this framework, became a kind of social safety valve, deplored in public, tolerated in private, and essential to the maintenance of respectable households. Married women were expected to remain sexually reserved, often discouraged from even acknowledging desire. Men, meanwhile, were quietly permitted to seek elsewhere what their wives were not supposed to provide. This hypocrisy was woven into every layer of Victorian society. Politicians thundered about virtue in Parliament while frequenting brothels at night. Clergymen preached sermons on purity while paying for the services of the very women they denounced. Judges sentenced prostitutes for disorderly conduct while overlooking the men who had solicited them. Newspapers reported scandals in hushed tones, occasionally revealing the involvement of titled aristocrats or well-known officials, but rarely naming names. Male reputations could be preserved, female reputations were ruined beyond repair. The concept of the fallen woman illustrates this cruel asymmetry. A man who sinned could repent, resume his career, and even be celebrated for his vigour. A woman who fell lost everything: family ties, employment, respectability. Charitable institutions such as Magdalene asylums offered a narrow path of redemption, but this redemption required renouncing sexuality altogether, embracing strict discipline, and living under religious instruction. Very few women managed to transition back into respectable society. For most, the fall was permanent. Literature of the period both reflected and reinforced these double standards. In novels by writers such as Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, and George Eliot, the fallen woman was a recurring figure. Tragic, sympathetic, but doomed. Dickens' Nancy in Oliver Twist sacrifices herself to save others but dies violently, her virtue unrecoverable. Hardy's Tess in Tess of the d'Urbervilles suffers after being raped, yet society condemns her rather than her rapist. Such narratives elicited pity but rarely justice, cementing the notion that women bore ultimate responsibility for sexual transgression. The hypocrisy was particularly evident in discussions of public health. As seen in the Contagious Diseases Acts, prostitutes were treated as vectors of disease, subject to invasive examinations and confinement. Yet the men who infected them and carried disease back to their families faced no legal or medical scrutiny. The underlying assumption was clear: women were to blame, men were excused. Even scientific discourse perpetuated the bias, portraying female sexuality as dangerous, deviant, and pathological, while male sexuality was considered normal, even necessary. Feminist reformers seized upon this double standard as a rallying cry. Josephine Butler and her allies denounced not only the injustice of the Contagious Diseases Acts, but the entire moral framework that permitted men's vices while destroying women's lives. In speeches and writings, Butler declared, "There cannot be one law for the woman and another for the man. Purity must be demanded of both, or it will exist in neither." Her insistence on equality challenged the very foundation of Victorian gender ideology. The broader public, however, was reluctant to confront the contradiction. Respectable families often preferred silence. To acknowledge the scale of prostitution and the complicity of men would have been to admit that the veneer of morality was fragile, that the angel of the house lived side by side with the prostitute in the same city, sometimes in the same household. Middle-class wives quietly tolerated their husbands' absences, knowing or suspecting the truth, because their survival depended on maintaining appearances. Even among the working classes, the double standard persisted. Men boasted of their conquests in taverns, while women faced ostracism for the slightest deviation from propriety. A maid who became pregnant out of wedlock lost her position. A male servant who fathered the child might face no consequences. Respectability, scarce and fragile, was always more easily lost by women than by men. The irony of the situation was not lost on contemporaries. Satirical magazines such as Punch occasionally lampooned the hypocrisy, portraying lecherous gentlemen sneaking into brothels under cover of darkness. Reformers published tracts exposing the prevalence of vice among the respectable classes. Yet satire and pamphlets could not erase the lived reality, a society that punished women for men's desires, that demanded chastity from one half of the population while excusing indulgence in the other. The double standard also shaped law enforcement. Police officers were far more likely to arrest women for solicitation than to prosecute men for purchasing sex. Court records reveal countless cases of women fined or imprisoned for disorderly conduct, while men were treated as witnesses or victims. The prostitute was criminalized, the client ignored. This pattern reinforced the idea that women's bodies, not men's choices, were the root of vice. In the private diaries and letters of the period, glimpses of resistance emerge. Some women rejected the label of fallen, insisting on their dignity despite poverty and stigma. A few boldly spoke of the injustice of a world that condemned them, while protecting the men who exploited them. Their voices, though rare, remind us that not all women accepted the double standard silently. The persistence of this hypocrisy reveals much about Victorian culture. It was not simply prudishness or repression, but a system designed to maintain male dominance. By holding women to impossible standards while excusing men, the double standard reinforced patriarchal control of sexuality, marriage, and property. Prostitution, far from being an aberration, was woven into the structure of society, tolerated because it served male needs, condemned because it threatened female respectability. The contradictions of Victorian morality would eventually come under greater scrutiny as the century progressed. The feminist movement gained strength, literature grew more daring, and medical science began to challenge older assumptions about sexuality. Yet the double standard remained stubborn, shaping not only the lives of prostitutes but the lives of all women, whose reputations hung by a thread in a society that demanded purity but supplied temptation at every turn. As the narrative moves forward, it becomes clear that this hypocrisy was not only enshrined in law and morality, but also in culture and representation. The next chapter will turn to literature, art, and the visual imagination of the Victorian age, examining how prostitutes were portrayed and how those portrayals both reflected and shaped the realities of their lives. Victorian England was a culture of images and words, and its anxieties about prostitution found powerful expression in literature, art, and the theatre. Even while prostitution itself was deemed unspeakable in polite conversation, its shadow haunted the novels people read, the paintings they gazed at, and the plays they attended. To understand how society viewed the prostitute, one must look not only at police reports and reform tracts, but also at the cultural imagination that surrounded her. In literature, the figure of the fallen woman became almost archetypal. Charles Dickens, the most widely read novelist of his time, gave readers Nancy and Oliver Twist. Nancy is a prostitute, but Dickens portrays her with compassion. She is violent and coarse at times, yet ultimately self-sacrificing. Her murder by Bill Sikes is among the most chilling scenes in Victorian fiction, and it moved readers to pity rather than condemnation. Still, Nancy's fate followed the script. The fallen woman could be redeemed only through suffering and death. Thomas Hardy took this narrative even further in Tess of the d'Urbervilles, 1891. Tess is seduced, or raped, as many modern readers interpret it, by Alec d'Urberville. Though she is blameless, society labels her ruined. Hardy portrays Tess as pure in spirit, but her fall is irreversible. The tragedy culminates in her execution, a commentary on the mercilessness of Victorian morality. Hardy's novel scandalised critics precisely because it forced readers to confront the injustice of holding women accountable for what men inflicted upon them. Other writers use similar tropes. George Eliot's Adam Bede, 1859, features Hetty Sorrel, a young woman seduced by a wealthy man. When she becomes pregnant, she attempts to conceal it and ultimately abandons her child, leading to her trial for infanticide. Though not explicitly a prostitute, Hetty embodies the peril of female desire in a society with no mercy for mistakes. Like Nancy and Tess, she is a victim of social double standards. These literary depictions reflected reality, but also shaped public perception. By continually portraying prostitutes and fallen women as doomed, literature reinforced the sense that once a woman strayed from virtue, redemption was impossible. Yet, paradoxically, such stories also evoked sympathy, stirring reformist impulses among middle-class readers who were moved by the plight of fictional heroines. Visual art offered its own interpretations. Victorian painters, especially those associated with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, often depicted women in ambiguous situations. Works like Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Found portray a prostitute confronted by a former lover, her shame evident. These paintings were moral lessons as much as aesthetic objects. They warned viewers of the dangers of vice while indulging in its fascination. Other artists hinted at prostitution through allegory. A fashionable woman in luxurious dress, lounging idly in a richly furnished room, might be coded as a courtesan. The contrast between respectable domestic interiors and the suggestive decadence of such images conveyed a moral warning, but the paintings also offered titillation. The prostitute was simultaneously condemned and eroticized. Theatre and the music hall added yet another layer. On the legitimate stage, overt references to prostitution were rare, due to censorship laws and the vigilance of the Lord Chamberlain's office. Still, audiences recognised the coded language of fallen women in melodramas. In music halls, where respectability mingled with ribald humour, female performers themselves were sometimes suspected of leading double lives. Jokes, songs and innuendos often played upon the blurred line between performer and prostitute. Satirical cartoons in magazines like Punch frequently depicted prostitutes and their clients. These illustrations often mocked the hypocrisy of middle-class men or highlighted the visibility of prostitutes in urban life. In one cartoon, a clergyman hurries down a London street, averting his eyes from a group of prostitutes, while the women laugh knowingly. Such satire acknowledged what official discourse denied, that prostitution was omnipresent. The prostitute also appeared in popular ballads and broadsides, where her story was told in song. Sometimes she was a tragic heroine, seduced and betrayed. Sometimes she was a comic figure, mocking her customers. These cheap publications circulated widely, carrying ambivalent messages that ranged from moral caution to bawdy entertainment. Cultural representation thus mirrored the double attitude of Victorian society itself: condemnation on the surface, fascination underneath. Literature and art rarely advocated openly for prostitutes, but they gave the public a lens through which to view them. Sympathy mingled with stigma, fascination blended with fear. Every depiction carried moral weight, even when it claimed to entertain. Importantly, these portrayals also shaped how prostitutes were imagined, often in ways that obscured their real lives. Fiction emphasized tragedy and inevitability, as if no prostitute could ever escape her fate. Paintings eroticized them, reducing complex human beings to symbols of sin. Theatre and satire played upon stereotypes rather than realities. The voices of prostitutes themselves were largely absent from these cultural productions. Yet the very persistence of these images suggests the centrality of prostitution in the Victorian imagination. It was not a hidden corner of society but a defining anxiety, constantly resurfacing in cultural forms. Writers and artists returned to it again and again because it spoke to larger questions: the fragility of virtue, the tension between desire and morality, the hypocrisies of respectability. By the end of the 19th century, cultural depictions began to shift. The rise of realism in literature and the visual arts encouraged more direct portrayals of social issues. Novelists like George Gissing addressed prostitution in less moralizing ways, focusing on the economic pressures that drove women into it. Painters too grew bolder, sometimes depicting the harshness of street life without allegory. The late Victorian period thus planted seeds for a more nuanced understanding, though the old stereotypes lingered. In sum, literature and art served as both mirror and mould. They reflected the anxieties of a society that lived with prostitution daily, and they shaped the perceptions that justified its treatment of women. To read Victorian novels or view Victorian paintings is to enter a world where prostitutes were at once condemned, pitied, eroticized, and essential. Their cultural representation reveals as much about the society that produced it as about the women themselves. The next chapter will turn from representation to lived experience once more, exploring the institutions created to save or reform prostitutes and the complex motives behind them. By the mid-19th century, Victorians were not content simply to denounce prostitution or regulate it through law. They also sought to rescue the women who had fallen into its orbit. From church pulpits to philanthropic committees, the cry arose: these women must be saved, not only from vice and disease, but from themselves. Thus began the proliferation of rescue homes, reformatories and penitentiaries designed specifically for prostitutes. Yet whether these institutions offered genuine hope or merely new forms of control is a question that still unsettles historians today. The most famous of these were the Magdalene asylums, institutions named after Mary Magdalene, who in Christian tradition was associated, though inaccurately, with repentance from sexual sin. The Magdalene ideal became a model for fallen women. They could be redeemed, but only through complete renunciation of their former lives and submission to strict discipline. Inside such asylums, women wore plain uniforms, adhered to rigid schedules of prayer and work, and lived under constant supervision. The hope was that, stripped of temptation and trained in humility, they might be rehabilitated into respectable domestic servants. Rescue homes sprang up across England, often supported by evangelical groups. Some were small, housing only a dozen women, others held hundreds. Their founders varied from wealthy benefactors to reform-minded clergy to groups of determined middle-class women. Their rhetoric emphasised compassion, but their methods were often severe. Daily life inside these homes bore little resemblance to freedom. The women rose early, attended long religious services, performed manual labour such as laundry, sewing or scrubbing floors, and lived in near silence. Letters were censored, movement was restricted, and obedience was demanded. Critics at the time, and later historians, have noted the paradox. The institutions claimed to offer refuge and redemption, but they functioned much like prisons. A woman who left before completing her term was considered a failure. Those who stayed were reshaped according to a narrow ideal of womanhood, submissive, industrious, and pious. In rescuing prostitutes, society did not so much offer them choices as impose a new identity. Some homes were harsher than others. The penitentiaries for fallen women, as they were sometimes called, leaned heavily on punishment. A woman's past was treated as sin to be beaten out through labour and repentance. Accounts survive of women forced to kneel for hours in prayer or locked away in solitary confinement for disobedience. Critics compared them to monasteries or even prisons. Yet not all rescue institutions were devoid of kindness. A number of reformers sincerely wished to help women escape exploitation. The homes provided shelter, food, and medical care that many women desperately needed. For those fleeing violent pimps or abusive clients, the asylum could be a haven. Some women did succeed in transitioning into respectable employment, particularly in domestic service, which remained one of the few acceptable occupations for working-class women. Still, the question lingered. Whose needs were really being served? Rescue homes reassured respectable Victorians that something was being done about prostitution. They symbolised society's determination to uphold morality, while simultaneously keeping prostitutes out of sight. For middle-class female reformers, managing these homes offered a rare opportunity for authority and influence in a public sphere otherwise denied to them. Thus, the act of rescue could serve the rescuers as much as, if not more than, the rescued. The tension between compassion and control is visible in the writings of reformers like Josephine Butler. Unlike many, Butler opposed coercive methods. She argued that true redemption required love, not punishment, and that women should not be forced into institutions. Her campaigns emphasized dignity and voluntary choice. Yet even Butler's vision was shaped by the assumption that prostitutes must abandon their trade entirely to regain respectability. First-hand accounts from women who lived in these institutions are rare but revealing. Some expressed gratitude, noting that they had found shelter when they had nowhere else to go. Others described the oppressive atmosphere, the endless sermons, and the sense that they were being treated as children or criminals. One woman, after leaving a Magdalene asylum, wrote bitterly, "They taught me how to pray, but not how to live." The very architecture of these homes reflected their ambiguous purpose. High walls, barred windows, and locked doors separated the women from the world outside. Within, chapels dominated the layout, while workrooms stood at the centre of daily life. Every detail reminded the residents that they were being reformed, not simply housed. To Victorian society, the success of these homes was measured not in the happiness of the women, but in the maintenance of respectability. A woman who emerged as a quiet domestic servant was considered a triumph. One who returned to the streets was branded a hopeless failure. Rarely did anyone ask what the women themselves wanted for their lives. Rescue homes also played into broader anxieties about urban disorder. By removing prostitutes from the streets, they reassured middle-class citizens that vice was being contained. They aligned neatly with Victorian ideals of cleanliness, order, and moral discipline. In this sense, the homes were part of a larger project of social control, seeking to regulate not just bodies but spaces. Nevertheless, even within these confines, women sometimes asserted agency. Some entered rescue homes temporarily to escape immediate hardship, then left on their own terms. Others formed bonds of friendship or solidarity that sustained them afterward. Though constrained, their choices remind us that even in restrictive environments, women negotiated their survival in complex ways. By the end of the 19th century, the rescue movement faced growing criticism. Social scientists and reformers began to argue that poverty, not sin, drove women into prostitution, and that moral lectures could not cure economic desperation. New institutions focused more on training and employment opportunities, moving away from purely religious penitence. The seeds of modern social work can be traced to this shift. Still, the legacy of Victorian rescue homes is contested. To some, they represent genuine efforts at charity within the limits of their time. To others, they stand as monuments to hypocrisy, control, and the refusal to listen to women's own voices. What is clear is that they reveal the contradictions of a society that simultaneously pitied, punished, and patronized prostitutes, without ever granting them full humanity. As we turn to the next chapter, we leave behind the walls of the asylum and return to the wider stage of Victorian life, where scandals involving the elite, politicians, aristocrats, and public figures, reveal the persistent entanglement of prostitution with power, and the ways in which the social evil reached into the very heart of respectability. Victorian England prided itself on a facade of respectability, yet beneath that polished exterior lay a world of secrets and scandals. Prostitution, though condemned in sermons and hidden behind euphemisms in polite society, was entangled with the lives of the very men who claimed to uphold morality. When these entanglements became public, they exposed the hypocrisies of the age and sent shockwaves through society. Aristocrats, politicians, and even members of the royal household were not immune to the lure of London's brothels and courtesans. In fact, their participation was an open secret. Elite gentlemen frequented exclusive establishments in the West End, where high-class prostitutes known as courtesans entertained them with wit, beauty, and discretion. Courtesans often wielded significant influence, their liaisons with powerful men giving them access to wealth and status that few women could otherwise achieve. Yet, when discretion failed, scandal erupted. The newspapers, increasingly bold by the late 19th century, sometimes seized upon these stories. Though names were often veiled with initials, the public was quick to speculate. Gossip magazines thrived on innuendo, and caricatures in satirical journals hinted at identities with exaggerated clues. The double standard again revealed itself. Men caught in such scandals might endure temporary embarrassment, but women's reputations were destroyed beyond repair. One of the most notorious cases was the Cleveland Street scandal of 1889. Though it involved a male brothel rather than female prostitutes, its implications were explosive. Police uncovered a network of telegraph boys providing sexual services to aristocratic clients in a house on Cleveland Street. Rumours quickly spread that high-ranking officials, even members of the royal family, were implicated. The press published lurid details, though names were carefully suppressed. The scandal revealed how deeply sexual commerce penetrated elite circles, and how authorities bent over backward to shield powerful men from exposure. For women, the scandals took a different form. Courtesans like Catherine Walters, known as Skittles, and Lily Langtry, the Jersey Lily, became celebrities in their own right. Langtry, an actress and mistress of the Prince of Wales, epitomised the intertwining of performance, sexuality, and aristocratic patronage. While Langtry cultivated an image of glamour, other courtesans lived precariously, their fortunes tied to the favour of wealthy protectors. Their presence in high society both fascinated and unsettled Victorians, who could not reconcile their admiration for these women's beauty with their condemnation of their profession. Another revealing case was that of Harriet Wilson, a courtesan who, though belonging more to the Regency than the High Victorian period, left an indelible mark with her scandalous memoirs. Published in the 1820s but widely read throughout the century, her memoirs named dozens of noble lovers, from dukes to politicians. "Publish and be damned," one aristocrat famously retorted, when she threatened to reveal his name unless paid for silence. Wilson's boldness set the stage for later generations of courtesans who understood the power of exposure in a society obsessed with secrecy. Scandals also emerged from the courts. where divorce trials occasionally unveil the connections between respectable men and prostitutes. The 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act had made divorce more accessible, and sensational cases often drew large audiences. Testimonies revealed affairs with prostitutes, visits to brothels, and hidden debts to madams. Newspapers eagerly reported the salacious details, blurring the line between moral outrage and prurient curiosity. The contradictions were stark. On the one hand, Victorian society demanded that its leaders embody moral rectitude. On the other, those very leaders participated in the trade they condemned. This tension eroded public trust and provided ammunition for reformers like Josephine Butler, who argued that prostitution could not be eradicated by punishing women alone, while men in positions of power escaped scrutiny. The role of the press in these scandals cannot be overstated. Early Victorian newspapers had been cautious, constrained by libel laws and the dictates of respectability. But by the 1870s and 1880s, with the rise of the penny press and an expanding reading public, sensational journalism flourished. Editors discovered that nothing sold papers like sex and scandal. Though names were often disguised, readers learned to read between the lines, and the damage to reputations was real. Not all scandals involved individuals, some were institutional. The Contagious Diseases Acts, meant to regulate prostitutes in military garrisons, became a national scandal in themselves once feminists revealed the invasive examinations inflicted upon women. The exposure of these practices shocked many middle-class readers who had been unaware of the state's involvement in sexual policing. In this sense, the scandal was not about a single man or woman, but about the complicity of government itself in perpetuating double standards. Scandals involving prostitution illuminated deeper truths about Victorian society. They showed that prostitution was not confined to dark alleys and poor neighbourhoods, but extended into the highest echelons of power. They revealed the fragility of reputations, the hunger of the press for sensational stories, and the unwillingness of authorities to confront male culpability. They also underscored the fascination Victorians had with vice, even as they claimed to despise it. For the prostitutes and courtesans at the centre of these scandals, the consequences were profound. Some leveraged notoriety into lasting fame, others were cast aside, ruined by exposure. For men, scandal was often survivable. For women, it was life-altering. Yet together, these stories reveal the entanglement of sex, power and hypocrisy that defined Victorian England. As the century drew to a close, such scandals continued to shape debates about morality, law and gender. They forced society to confront its contradictions, though rarely to resolve them. In the next and final chapter, we will turn to the legacy of these women, the ways in which their lives, often hidden or condemned in their own time, left an enduring imprint on history, memory, and the struggle for women's rights. The Victorian prostitute lived in the shadows of her age, yet her presence shaped society in profound ways. Though denounced from pulpits, regulated by law, and hidden from polite conversation, she could not be erased. Prostitution was woven into the fabric of Victorian life, an institution that reflected the contradictions of an empire obsessed with morality, yet complicit in vice. The legacy of these women, often forgotten or distorted, continues to speak to us today. For contemporaries, the prostitute was both a symbol and a scapegoat. She embodied the dangers of desire, the fragility of virtue, and the spectre of social disorder. Yet she was also indispensable, providing the outlet that maintained the facade of respectability in middle-class homes. This paradox defined her place in Victorian culture, central yet marginalised, visible yet silenced. One of the most enduring legacies lies in the campaigns for women's rights that prostitution helped to galvanise. The outcry against the Contagious Diseases Acts, led by Josephine Butler and her allies, marked one of the first large-scale feminist movements in Britain. Their protests linked sexual double standards to broader demands for equality, laying groundwork for later struggles over suffrage, education, and labour rights. Butler insisted that no society could be just while it punished women for sins in which men were equally, if not more, complicit. Her words resonate as a call for gender justice that extended far beyond the 19th century. In literature and art, the figure of the fallen woman became an enduring archetype. From Dickens' Nancy to Hardy's Tess, she haunted the Victorian imagination, embodying tragedy and injustice. These stories shaped cultural memory long after their immediate social context had passed. They preserved the prostitute not as she truly was, but as a symbol of morality's fragility, a character both pitied and condemned. Even today, the fallen woman trope lingers in popular culture, a reminder of how deeply Victorian narratives continue to influence modern perceptions of female sexuality. Historians of the 20th and 21st centuries have sought to recover the lived experiences behind these cultural images. Social historians, drawing on police records, court transcripts, and charitable archives, have revealed the diversity of women's lives within prostitution. Some were desperate, driven by poverty and survival. Others exercised a measure of agency, choosing courtesanship for the wealth and independence it could bring. By restoring nuance to these stories, scholars have challenged the one-dimensional portrayals that dominated earlier accounts. The rediscovery of these voices has also reframed our understanding of Victorian society itself. Prostitution was not an aberration, but a structural feature of the age, intertwined with economics, gender roles, and power. The existence of vast numbers of prostitutes testified to the limits of respectable employment for women, the inequalities of marriage, and the demands of a patriarchal system. To study prostitution is thus to study the very foundations of Victorian life. Another legacy lies in the built environment. The streets, alleys and districts once notorious for prostitution, areas like Covent Garden or Whitechapel in London, carry layers of memory. Though gentrified or redeveloped, they remain sites where the past lingers. Literary tours and historical walks today often highlight these districts, acknowledging the lives of women who once walked their pavements. In this sense, prostitutes have entered the urban memory of Victorian England, their presence remembered not through statues or monuments, but through geography and story. The moral panic surrounding prostitution also influenced legal and social institutions in ways that lasted long beyond the Victorian era. Rescue homes, reformatories, and social purity organisations evolved into the precursors of modern social work and public health initiatives. While their methods were often coercive and paternalistic, they reflected a growing recognition that society had a responsibility, however imperfectly conceived, to address issues of poverty, health, and gender inequality. At the same time, the legacy of stigma endured. For decades after the Victorian period, women associated with prostitution remained among the most marginalised in society. The Victorian habit of dividing women into pure and fallen categories cast a long shadow, shaping attitudes toward female sexuality well into the 20th century. Even today, echoes of this dichotomy persist in debates about sex work, morality, and women's autonomy. The historical memory of Victorian prostitution is therefore double-edged. On one side, it is a story of oppression, women punished for poverty, desire, or survival, condemned by a system that excused men and silenced female voices. On the other, it is a story of resistance and transformation, women who navigated impossible choices, reformers who challenged injustice, and a society forced to confront its own hypocrisies. Perhaps the most important legacy is the reminder that history is not only written by the powerful. The thousands of women who walked the streets of Victorian cities, who lived in cramped lodgings, who risked arrest, disease, and violence, were not merely passive victims. They were individuals with hopes, fears, and strategies for survival. Their lives complicate the tidy image of Victorian morality, revealing a world far more complex than official narratives allowed. In remembering them, we also confront the silences of history. Many left no written words, no portraits, no monuments. Their existence is preserved only in fragments, a name in a court record and a description in a police report, a fleeting mention in a diary. Yet those fragments, assembled by historians, testify to lives lived in defiance of erasure. As the curtain falls on the 19th century, the Victorian prostitute remains an unsettling figure, not only for what she was, but for what she reveals about the society around her. She forces us to see the contradictions of an age that built its identity on moral superiority while relying on hidden vice. She reminds us that progress is uneven, that reforms are contested, and that the voices of the marginalised must be sought out and honoured. In the end, the legacy of Victorian prostitution is not merely a story about sex or morality. It is a story about gender, power, and humanity. It is about the resilience of women in the face of stigma, the courage of reformers who spoke for justice, and the lessons we carry forward into our own debates about equality and freedom. And so, the women once dismissed as fallen stand in memory, if not in life, as witnesses to history, their suffering a condemnation of hypocrisy, their endurance a testament to survival, their silence a challenge to future generations to listen more closely to those whom society prefers to ignore. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey into the hidden world of Victorian England. The stories of these forgotten women remind us that history is not only about kings, queens, and great battles, but also about the lives lived in the shadows, fragile, complex, and deeply human. As you drift into rest, may these echoes from the past bring you calm reflection and a gentle reminder of how far we have come and how much there is still to remember. If you enjoyed this story and would like to explore more untold chapters of history together, don't forget to subscribe and return for another peaceful tale. Until then, good night and sweet dreams.